Hi, good morning, everybody. I think we'll make a start because we could be waiting. People will just join us when they get here. So good morning. My name's Elizabeth. I'm the Training and Development Worker for Anti-Cancer. So I'll be kind of co-hosting today with Adrian. Adrian will introduce himself shortly. So let's just crack on, shall we? So thanks for joining us today. Hope you enjoy the session. Adrian, can I have the next slide, please? So for all of our sessions, we do have like a set of guidelines that we like to work through. It just gives some structure to the session and just keeps us all on the same page, so to speak. So today's session, it will be kind of fast-paced. We've got a lot to get through, so apologies if we do seem to move at quite a speed. We will keep you all on silent, but you can take yourself off silent, mute anytime. Well, at certain times. The only reason we do it is to manage that background noise. You should have subtitles on your screen. Now you can choose to keep them or to get rid of them depending on what your preference is. All the slides and the supporting links and information that we discussed today will be sent out after the session ends. But if you want to take notes, please feel free to do so. The session will be recorded for those people who can't make it today. If you don't want to be on the recording, just keep your camera off. It only records the speaker who's speaking at the moment. So don't worry if you can keep your camera on. It's only when you want to speak that you will be recorded. We ask everybody to treat this space like they would a meeting in real life. That means keep all our comments in the chat box, respectful and mindful of everybody in the room. And if we take ourselves off mute and we speak, treat each other with respect and give each other the respect that we're all due. After the session, there will be an informal 30-minute session where we can network and have those chats that we want to. During the session, we will stop for 2 Q&A sessions. So after Ben's session, after Ben's done his bit, Ben will introduce himself shortly, and Eva's done her bit. They're okay to take questions though at those times. So if you've got any questions, either hold on to them those times. If they're burning, put them in the chat box, or you can wait till the 30-minute session at the end. Cancer, we're not discussing too much about cancer today, but however, it will be brought up in some of the presentations. It's always an emotive subject, and so are some of the topics that we're going to be covering today. So for anybody who feels they may need any additional help and support, they can either email me and Adrian, they can put it in the chat box with some contact details, and we can get back to you after the session. Or if you hang fire for after the 30 minutes, you can talk to us then. If there's anything that goes on during the session that is a little bit too emotive for you, turn your camera off and just take 5 minutes and then join us back in the session when you want to. The dodgy internet barking dogs and parcel deliveries is just a nod to the fact that I'm working at home. My dog's lively this morning. I don't know what's up with her. She keeps barking all the time. The postman hasn't been yet, so when the postman does finally come, she'll lose it. So I'm just warning you in advance, she'll lose it. So apologies for that. If the internet goes, you should be okay to stay where you are. I'll reboot and come back in the room, but Adrian's also got control. So the session will just go ahead. And what I'm asking, Jade is taking notes of everybody who enters the session today. But if you could all just type your name in the chat box, just so we've got another, like a backup, that would be great. I think I've covered, oh, yeah, I've mentioned the recording. So on to the next slide, please, Adrian. So today's session, so there is an agenda already in the chat. It's one of the first comments that I put in there this morning. It's already in there for anybody who wants to refer back to it throughout the session, so you can see what's coming up next. But this morning we've got the Adrian Smith at the Q&A Hub lead. He'll be taking us through the introduction shortly. Then he's going to put on a different hat and take us through a presentation called On the Shoulders of Giants, which is a brief history of LGBT plus in the UK. Then we've got a session from Ben Hayworth, the Macmillan Survivorship Network Manager, about LGBT plus accessing services and patient journey. Then we've got one of our great lead answer cancer champions, Eva Echo, who'll be taking us through experiences accessing health services. Then we've got a brief update. Then, as with all our sessions, we do have some work to do. We've got a few forms to fill in. Then we'll just go through what happens next, and Adrian will close the session. And then anybody who wants to stay behind at that point to have an informal chat, talk to us about what plans they've got coming up, or ask us any questions they want to, can do in that 30 minutes after the session. Unfortunately, Eva and Ben cannot stay for the 30 minutes afterwards. So if you've got any questions for those two people, please ask at the designated slots when they ask for questions. Okay, I think that's me done, Adrian. So over to you. Thank you. Enjoy Brilliant. The session, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Just to check with you, Nod, my sound's okay? Brilliant. Thank you very much. Hello and welcome to everybody. I kind of feel like I say it every time, but particularly when it's a really lovely day outside. Thank you for coming indoors and spending a couple of hours with us this morning. I'm going to keep my introduction brief because I'm actually going to jump into my second session. And kind of Elizabeth kind of said, oh, this might be kind of a useful place to kind of start off with. So some kind of, I suppose, what look like figures and statistic on a page, but actually kind of a bit of context and a bit of, I suppose, a description about the reality for some LGBT plus people, for some of our communities. And it's probably, you know, one place to start when we kind of want to start thinking about and understanding what kind of barriers, what inequalities face some of our communities. And certainly some of the figures there are kind of very stark reminders of those barriers and some of those kind of inequalities. And of course, LGBT plus communities, they're not kind of unique in the sense that kind of they face barriers to screening. If you know, that's kind of why Answer Cancer exists, because there are a lot of inequalities and barriers for our communities across. But there's kind of, I suppose, something kind of, you know, particular, or something that kind of goes on for some LGBT communities, which mean that kind of their access to some services, or in this instance, their access to screening, just might be different to other sectors of kind of communities. And certainly Ben, I'm kind of looking ahead to Ben's presentation. Ben's going to talk in a bit more detail about kind of what this kind of means. And then it's probably also kind of a useful reminder that, you know, inequalities and barriers and systemic barriers, they're kind of also linked as well. So kind of people within our communities also kind of, you know, some might face multiple or barrier, but faced stacked upon barrier. And that's kind of something else kind of really important, what we kind of might describe as that intersectionality, where things kind of link up and where inequalities and barriers are compounded one-on-one. And I think for me as well, it's probably also kind of worthwhile noting that kind of as a place to start, it's just kind of one place to start. We've kind of come together today to kind of find out from each other's experiences, but also, you know, to kind of maybe find out about a topic which is kind of new to us, to find out kind of different kind of ideas as well. But I think the other thing that's kind of really important to kind of start off with as well is something kind of around kind of celebration. And it's kind of something about not just seeing people, and I mean this kind of generally, seeing people as kind of problems. So one of my kind of most kind of overused quotes is, people are not the problem, they are the solution. And that's kind of absolutely true of all of our communities across kind of Greater Manchester. As a nice segue into my next section, July is actually the anniversary of the first UK Pride. So the first Pride that took place in London in July back in 1972. So that makes the first Pride within my lifetime. And what's kind of interesting is certainly kind of as what I'm going to share with you next, I'd like you to kind of reflect on what is a lot of modern history for people. So as we kind of are in kind of Pride Month, as we come into it across Greater Manchester, a season of kind of lots of prides, and it's really wonderful to hear about kind of the prides kind of taking place across the place. I think it's also kind of really nice to reflect on the great, the good, the inspiring, and the people as well who kind of come together to make a difference in their own lives and in their communities' lives as well. So nice segue, I hope, into kind of my next section. And I suppose, taking off my Answer Cancer hat and going to put on my hat where I was part of a team of community curators at the People's History Museum. And I'm going to give you the quickest overview of some really interesting stories of LGBT plus communities across largely England and Wales, but kind of further. And what I've tried to do is I've tried to pull out some really lovely examples which cover health, because obviously that's a topic we're thinking about today. I'm going to take you up and down. So what I mean by that is there'll probably be some stories or some slides that I share that will kind of make you maybe sit up and think a bit, but also hopefully kind of some balance for some stories that will kind of make you think, wow, that's kind of quite interesting as well. The language I will use, I will be inclusive in my language, but also kind of just to acknowledge that some of the language from, you know, the olden days, as it were, is not terminology that we'd use kind of today. So historic terms, kind of things like gay liberation, for example, they were inclusive terms at its times. So I'll try to be inclusive in my language and substitute LGBT plus communities where I can. But you know, that's kind of maybe a useful place to start about kind of inclusive language. So People's History Museum, if you've not been to it, it's in Manchester. It's a wonderful free museum. It's the Museum of Struggle, and it has a lot of collections about kind of related to Manchester as well. But in 2017, it put on an exhibit which was to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Sexual Offences Bill. And that was kind of a landmark bill because in 1967, it decriminalised homosexuality between men in England and Wales in certain circumstances. So what that means is it kind of decriminalised it if you were over 21, so there was inequality there. It decriminalised it if it was in private, and that meant that you couldn't be in a hotel, couldn't be in a house with somebody else in the other room as well. So that kind of, strictly speaking, wasn't covered by the Act. And it's probably worthwhile noting that the similar, I suppose, statute in Scotland was decriminalised in 1980, and in the Isle of Man in 1992. So talk about kind of modern history. And the museum kind of exhibit was amazing. It was opened by Sir Ian McCallum. It was the biggest kind of opening night of its kind of new exhibits in the museum's kind of history. It was kind of a huge affair. And the exhibit was kind of quite lovely because what it did was kind of bring schools and colleges, kind of workplace as well, kind of, you know, they all came around. We had kind of family days. And it stayed open for kind of several months. We had kind of young people's days and chills days and family days where they came and did kind of colouring in as well. And one of the things that I did was I took some guides, was a guide, and I kind of took people around the exhibit. And it was always the young people's kind of reactions, particularly on that timeline, that kind of made me stop and think about, you know, the progress and kind of the communities and kind of what's come before. Because young people, I'd kind of start off at one end and I'd ask them kind of questions about kind of when do you think this happened? And they were just amazed that, you know, some of the equalities that we have now have not always been in place. And that's kind of quite humbling to think that kind of the younger generation kind of now are kind of aware of that. So I'm going to do kind of a quick, can't do a quick hands up. I kind of can't see people. So maybe you want to put it in the chat box as well. So let's kind of start off with this one. Chat box, quick answer. When do you think the age of consent for men, so men who have sex with men, was lowered to 16? And this will be in England and Wales. I'll tell you what, I'm going to look at the chat box. So just quickly type in a date when you think that was. Oh, I can't see my chat box, Elizabeth, so you'll have to shout a few out for me.
So mine was 1990. I've got 1992. I've got 2008.
Yep.
I've got 1998.
Okay.
I've got 1995. 2010, as recent as 2010. I'm hoping that is not the right answer.
Right, 2001 for that one. Equal rights
2001.
for adoption.
Well, let's start again. So I'm just going to put thanks, and then we'll put the next one in. So now I know where to begin. Equal rights for adoption. I'm going to go.
So what have we got for answers?
We've got I think we've got 2010, 2012, 2001, 2009.
Right, okay.
2002.
Tiny bit earlier, 2002, bang on it.
Oh.
So pretty much most of these refer to England and Wales, and in some instances they refer to when the bill actually came into effect, as it were. So bills often take some time to get through passage. So 2002. So before that, discrimination and inequality in terms of adoption rights, and that was kind of the source of lots of, if you like, kind of battles, kind of legal battles between kind of parents and children, children who they wanted to adopt or kind of foster. Employment equality, 2003. So that particular act, so before 2003, what that meant was employers could discriminate against LGBT plus people. So that meant in terms of hiring them, in terms of not promoting them, people had no protection from bullying at work before 2003. Which is just incredible to think of. What about the Gender Recognition Act? So the Gender Recognition Act kind of gave trans people full recognition in terms of their kind of gender. So this was the act that allows for a new birth certificate, for example.
We're in the 2000s now. I think we're getting the idea that it's not as recent as we think it is.
Yeah.
So we've got 2001, 2004, 2003. Martin's gone 2010. So I think we're getting the idea that it's not as far back as we first thought.
Right. So 2004 Act
2005.
came into effect 2005. And marriage. So obviously we had kind of a couple of acts referring to the legal partnerships that could exist between same-sex people. So civil partnerships was earlier. The marriage, the so-called Same-Sex Couples Act, 2013. So that's as recent as 2013, that one. And kind of, as I say, kind of when I showed this to kind of the young people, staggered, kind of mind blowing that, this modern history. And, what I'd like to kind of invite you to do as we kind of go through this kind of is reflect on the impact of that modern history. So it's not always several hundred years ago, although I'm going to take you back a bit. Somebody kind of my kind of generation, somebody kind of older, even people kind of a lot younger, facing that inequality in law amongst kind of other ones. So I'm going to start off by taking you all the way back to 1880 and the infamous Manchester drag ball. So this was a drag ball that took place in Hume in Manchester. After a tip-off, the police were kind of spying on this ball. It was kind of all blacked out in kind of a building and the windows were blacked out, but because it was quite hot inside, somebody opened a window, which kind of let the police kind of see inside. Now, in order to get into the ball, you had to give a password, which was sisters. I don't know how the police found that out, but they whispered the word sisters and were admitted into kind of what they saw. And they found 20 men dressed in kind of what was described as female attire. About 50 guys were kind of there in total, and they were all obviously arrested. And the judge claimed that the offences were too abominable to be read out in front of the court. And the men were charged with solicitation and incitement with each other to commit an unnameable act. So in the end, the men kind of got off with, a huge at the time, a £25 fine for good behaviour. But actually the biggest impact of things like this was that kind of their names would be released in the press, which kind of meant disgrace. So what that meant was kind of, they faced kind of ruin in society. So, until very recently, up until the 60s, that kind of practice of kind of printing occupations, addresses, even in this instance, who was wearing women's clothing was splashed in local newspapers and across the land. What you see there is a picture of the drag ball held by the George House Trust, so a really big, important charity in across Greater Manchester. And then in a wonderful kind of reclaiming of that and an acknowledgement of our kind of, history, there's the annual drag ball held by George House Trust, but it obviously has its origins back in the Hume drag ball of 1880. I'm going to kind of really quickly kind of take you kind of through, we jump ahead a little bit. This is 1908. And in 1908, a young Winston Churchill was standing for re-election in Manchester Northwest. So the constituency doesn't exist anymore, but it covered bits of Ardwick. It covered bits of kind of Moss Side as well. And he was standing, and at the time he was a member of the Liberal Party. He kind of wasn't the good guy that some of you may or may not think he kind of went on to become, because at the time he was against universal suffrage, so didn't believe in votes for women. And he also thought that women should be banned from working in pubs because it led to unsavory lifestyles. So three wonderful women amongst kind of others. There were Eva Gore-Booth and Esther Roper. So they are described as partners. So we might describe them as girlfriends. They may even have been wives in kind of, our kind of in more modern kind of times. But Eva and Esther were campaigners who formed in Manchester the Barmaids Defence League. And together with their sister, the wonderful Countess Constance Makievicz, they got a 4-horse drawn carriage, which they rode around the streets of Manchester, parked it in Stevenson Square, where they held rallies, standing and speaking on top of the carriage. And one heckler was heard to kind of shout out, "Can you cook a dinner, love?" To which Eva kind of shouted out, "Yes, can you drive a coach and four?" So they kind of campaigned in this kind of, her and her girlfriend campaigned in this kind of wonderful way. And Churchill did not get elected. He lost his re-election. So Manchester kicked out Winston Churchill at that time. I'm going to pause very briefly and probably stretch this from Greater Manchester and tell you about Burnley. Now, you may or may not know that in the 70s, Burnley, an absolute hotbed of LGBT plus activism and liberation. At the beginning of the 1970s, there was a huge kind of public meeting, and kind of the gay liberation were involved, because the Campaign for Homosexuality wanted to turn a local cooperative building into the equivalent of a working men's club for gay communities, as kind of they described it. So that was in 71. This is kind of in jumping back later to 1978, when Mary Winter, who was a driver in Burnley Bus Company, she got sacked for wearing her lesbian liberation badge. So remember that kind of act I referred to, kind of the recent act. So in 1978, you had no protection at work. You could lose your job because of your sexuality, and probably you were not likely to get any support from a trade union then. So Mary refused to take off her badge, and she was sacked for it. And this kind of inspired a demonstration and a campaign. So students from Manchester came and kind of leafleted as well. It was also supported by the actress Vanessa Redgraves, who was part of the Workers' Revolutionary Party at the time, and she was standing for election in Manchester. So Burnley became the centre of this kind of national kind of demonstration and protest around lesbian liberation. It's kind of really incredible. So, I mean, Mary actually failed to, she didn't get her job back. She left the area, but kind of her history is traced that she remained active in lots of different causes. And actually, kind of a couple of years ago, Mary's story was turned into a play as well. So kind of really acknowledged, and there's walking tours of Burnley as part of Burnley's kind of hidden history. I'm going to come back to Manchester now and pause in Sackville Park. And some of you kind of may know that the Alan Turing Memorial is in Sackville Park, and they're kind of that kind of memorial there. That sculpture is of Alan Turing, and he's holding an apple with a bite out of his hand. So Alan Turing's kind of sitting kind of on that bench. And Alan Turing, for those of you who don't know, so you might know that he's just been put on a £50 note. So his contribution is kind of acknowledged in that way. But Turing was voted by the BBC kind of poll as the 21st most influential person in British history. So Turing's contribution was, he's known as the father of the computer and of artificial intelligence. So during the Second World War, his work, and he was only a young guy, he was only in his 30s, his work helped break the Nazis' Enigma code. So it helped turn the tide of the war. And there are some estimates that it saved several million lives and helped the war end 2 years earlier. So Turing left that, and on the back of his work, he came to Manchester. It was the Victoria University of Manchester, so he was kind of working locally, working on more computing, and helped develop Manchester computers. He met his boyfriend. He met his boyfriend at Oxford Road, and there was a burglary at his house. And when the police were called, they found out that he had a boyfriend, and he was actually prosecuted, and he was actually given the choice of prison or chemical castration. So he took that choice of chemical castration. So that was a series of injections, and Turing, his death was recorded. Turing committed suicide. The coroner recorded suicide from that. He had ingested arsenic, and it was believed the apple by his bed, one of the stories is that the apple by his bed was how he did it. And where another bit of whether it's urban lore or a nod, the Apple logo, so you see on Apple on iPhones or on computers, has a bite out of it. So some of the lore says that it's an acknowledgement to his contribution to science and the world we live in today. In 2013, he got a posthumous pardon from the Queen. So it took all that time for that great man's contribution to be acknowledged, and his pardon given. So Manchester's the home of some really wonderful people. We have people like Stephen Whittle, who's a professor of qualities law at Manchester Met, and he's a long-term trans rights activist. He founded Press for Change, which was the trans right group that helped lobby for the introduction of the Gender Recognition Act, for example. In Manchester, in 1988, we had one of the biggest protests against what was Clause 28, a clause introduced by Margaret Thatcher's government, designed to stop what they called the promotion of pretend families. So you couldn't talk about homosexuality in schools as a valid lifestyle. And this galvanized the community, and 20,000 people flooded into Albert Square in 1988. And Grant Stringer, who was then the leader of Manchester Council, he's now an MP, he described it as the largest national demonstration there's ever been in Manchester. And this wonderful picture you see in front of you, it's from the Manchester Library archives, and it's described as lesbians taking over Manchester Piccadilly Plaza, and it's really wonderful. But Pride obviously continues. We've got it coming up next month, hopefully in in real life as it were again. And Pride, that has its origins in Manchester from jumble sales and stalls back in 1985 on Canal Street. In 2017, it raised £160,000 for charities, and there's an estimated 170,000 people come into Manchester because of it. And we have some really wonderful, I suppose, I'll say spin-offs, but important parts of Pride as well. And these are a couple of pictures from the exhibit at the People's History Museum. So Black Pride was established in 2006, and it's now an annual event. And Rainbow Noir, so you see the t-shirts there, that's a Manchester volunteer-led peer support and community action group, which celebrates people of colour who identify as LGBT. This was an exhibit from the museum, Shakti. So Shakti was the first South Asian LGBT plus organisation in Europe, and that's a copy of their Pride entry that year, which discusses the 25 people who were brave enough to walk in front of the watching crowds. And again in Manchester, we have Hidayah, and that's an active group. It means guidance in Arabic. And again, volunteer-led charity working around the needs of LGBTQ plus Muslims as well. So an amazing heritage we have, and some amazing groups and support for our communities in Manchester as well. And almost from the great to the maybe the not so great. I won't pause to get answers in the chat box, but does anyone recognize who that is? So this, right, Elizabeth kind of knows, James Anderton, and James Anderton was Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police. He was kind of Deputy and Chief through from the parts of the 70s through to the 90s as well. And a very divisive kind of figure, and kind of divisive, I know, certainly around the riots that took place in Moss Side, where he was kind of quite heavy-handed afterwards. But James Anderton infamously described homosexuals, drug addicts, prostitutes who had HIV as swirling in a human cesspit of their own making. He also said that corporal punishment should be administered so that criminals beg for mercy. They should be punished until they repent of their sins. So this is the guy who looked after policing across Greater Manchester, and this is kind of how he kind of, I suppose, kind of, policed some of our communities in terms of raids. And that kind of, it was an interview that he gave, I think it was in Woman's Own, kind of that one. But that kind of, that background, and we showed kind of tabloid pictures from tabloids every day in that museum exhibit. And there were some, absolutely shocking ones, kind of certainly by our kind of, today's standards, of homophobia, of kind of ignorance, if you like, of misinformation. And so that's kind of the, the context in which kind of, kind of a lot of people kind of lived, a lot of people got kind of some of their news. But I've kind of pulled out a tweet kind of here from the National LGBT Plus Police Network, and they're talking about a police helmet, that the Bobby Dazzler police helmet that was used at Manchester Pride, and it was shown as an exhibit, and just kind of as a really nice reflection of kind of how far we've kind of come from that. The first conference in the UK about police and LGBT plus communities took place in Manchester, where there were 350 delegates. That was back in 1995. And there's that kind of really wonderful picture of Carl Austin and Ben and his partner, and that's at the exhibit, kind of wearing the helmets. And Carl was our first out mayor in Manchester as well. So really nice kind of examples of kind of, our kind of stories and how things change for the better as well. I'm going to go kind of a bit kind of quicker through kind of my last couple of slides, but here's another kind of one I'm interested to find out from the chat box. When was homosexuality, that's kind of the term used, when was it declassified as a mental illness by the World Health Organization? Any answers, Elizabeth? You're on mute. You're on mute, Elizabeth.
I've got from 1980 to 2005, 2015, no idea. Right. 2008. So okay. We're from no idea. From
1992.
Ah.
And I mean, I find that absolutely kind of staggering, really, really kind of staggering. And not only is that kind of modern history, but kind of, you kind of think, whoa, thank goodness we've moved kind of a long way from that. And kind of this is kind of one of the more shocking kind of headlines that I'm probably going to share today. It came up on my Twitter feed because that's kind of almost 28 years to the day. That's from the Daily Mail in July 2016. And imagine that being the acceptable view that you grow up with. This kind of idea of kind of, where science or mis-science is kind of used to kind of, I suppose, kind of perpetuate kind of bigotry and or kind of inequality. So you kind of think, oh, that's kind of long in the past. This is kind of from March 2009, and I don't know if you can kind of see it. And it refers to kind of what's known as aversion or conversion therapy. So the idea of curing LGBT kind of plus people as well. And the article from 2009 actually talks about 1/5 of therapists admit to having tried to cure their patients of their same-sex sexual attraction. So that's just kind of 2009. And you kind of might think, oh, thank goodness we've moved kind of away from that one. Well, in 2018, Theresa May's government promised to end conversion therapy. It's still not illegal, so that was a promise. Last summer, Boris Johnson said plans for the ban would be brought forward. In March of this year, the advisors from his advisory panel kind of left, saying it was too slow. And in the latest Queen's speech, the government announced not a banning of it, but a consultation that will be held in England and Wales before that law is changed. So, wow, you kind of think, haven't we come so far from those kind of early articles? Well, in some ways, kind of not far enough. And those kind of articles, you know, were kind of a part of kind of people's lives as we kind of grew up. And Colin was a figure who came into EastEnders, and the backlash when he was a gay man, and so Michael Cashman is now kind of a member of the House of Lords. But when he was an actor and came into EastEnders, huge outcry. Goodness, when he kissed someone in EastEnders, bigger outcry still. And what we had in the
Sorry, I'm just mindful of your timing. Just because of Ben.
Finish on this one, yeah, it's fine. I'm going to finish on this one.
Sorry,
it's all right. It's good. And kind of what we had in the exhibit was the anorak worn by Julie Hesmond Hall. So Julie is an actress, and she's not trans herself. She's not a trans woman herself. But what the role did do was introduce Hayley, the kind of one of the first kind of mainstream trans characters to everyday life. And she became kind of, you know, a loved and established kind of part of kind of it, and obviously is also a supporter in Greater Manchester. So I'm going to kind of stop there. Hopefully kind of what I've done is give you kind of a little bit of a feel and a think about kind of some of our history, some of our context. I might have given you a bit of pause to reflect upon how people come together to change, you know, change things, how people come together specifically around kind of health and activism and kind of well-being. So I'll kind of leave it there. So on the shoulders of giants. So I'm going to hand over to Ben. Ben, what I'll kind of do, if it's okay with you, I'll hand over the remote control so that you've kind of now got those. So let's kind of try that now, and you can just see if that works.
Okay.
Let's have a look. So do you have remote control now? Brilliant.
Yeah.
Right. Thanks a lot, Ben.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Adrian. So as Adrian said, I can only see the slides. I can't see you. So if you've got any questions or thoughts you want to contribute, then do put them in the chat and make yourself known to me somehow. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ben Hayworth. My pronouns are he and him. And I'm generally found at the Christie Hospital doing personalised care and other projects of that nature. And I have a little sideline in LGBT health, specifically around cancer and looking at things like smoking cessation as well. And I also teach at the University of Manchester. So this presentation is, you know, it's going to follow on really nicely from what Adrian's just been talking about, but really focusing a lot more on health and cancer. And it's basically split into two parts. The first part, I'm going to talk about the evidence base. And the second part, I'm going to talk about what we're doing to improve matters for LGBT people who might be affected by cancer. And it would be a reasonable question, I think, to ask, you know, what is it? Why are we talking about cancer when we talk about LGBT? What's the intersection? That's the word, isn't it, between LGBT and cancer? And why is it that so many people who identify as LGBT also report a poorer patient experience when they're affected by cancer and a worse clinical outcome? And there's been a lot of head scratching and thoughts around this issue over the past 10 years or so. One of the starting points for this was this Macmillan document here called Supporting Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual and Transgender People Affected by Cancer, where they were able to articulate some of the problems and statistics around the numbers, but had less success talking about some of the reasons why LGBT people might have poor outcomes and a worse patient experience. But if anybody wants to look at this document, it's a really good starting point on the topic, and it's very clear and well worth your time. It's worth mentioning at the start of this presentation, I'm going to be talking about health inequalities a lot. And I can't assume that everybody knows what we're talking about when we talk about a health inequality. And I just wanted to throw in a couple of quick descriptions before we went any further. So there's one here from the World Health Organization, which we've heard a lot about recently, of course. Differences in health status or in the distribution of health determinants between different population groups, producing avoidable and unfair distributions resulting in health inequalities and leading to inequity in health. Very complicated sentence, but I think the key words in there are the words avoidable and unfair. And I think you'll find as we probe into the world of LGBT that these two things become much clearer as we go along. There's a second description at the bottom that I'll also read out. Although there are multiple risk factors, there is increasing recognition that people's social characteristics play a part in quality of life and survivorship, where groups of people have different experiences or outcomes for cancer. These differences are known as cancer inequalities, and they include lesbian, gay, bisexual people and trans people. And as I'm sure you all know, when we talk about health inequalities, you'll find them cropping up in many documents and many improvement plans across all of our hospitals and our health systems. And it's something that we're all very, very focused on in GM and beyond. So a case study. Here we have a real patient who's given me permission to use his comments and his stories to illustrate an example of a health inequality in cancer care. And this chap is called Dean Eastman, and there's a picture of him just there. You'll see that he's one of our a younger patients affected by cancer. And this was his comment about the consent process at a sperm bank he attended before undertaking chemotherapy. And he says, "I brought up in conversation the fact that I'm gay, and the nurse lifted an eyebrow and said, 'Oh, this applies to straight people.' Being told that if I died, my male partner would not be able to use the sperm sample when a female partner could, felt like another slap in the face, another systematic discrimination against you as a gay person. The fact that an LGBT family or family to be out there would be in that position and wouldn't be able to have children in this way is horrendous." And the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority later clarified that there was a loophole which would allow Dean's partner to have the option to use his sperm in the future. But this is a classic example of something that wouldn't have been covered by previous legislation that we heard about in the last presentation, and that still stands as a discrimination against LGBT people when they want to talk about fertility, which is, I'm sure, as you all know, is one of those conversations that you need to have with patients when they're embarking on a cancer treatment such as chemotherapy. Dean goes on to talk about his experience on the wards and how staff would make assumptions about his sexual orientation. This is his comment. "I love how nurses assume I'm straight despite my pink cushions, my pink lemonade, and my copious episodes of Drag Race. I could vogue my way through the ward attached to my drip stand and they'd ask how my girlfriend is." Fortunately, when staff learnt more about Dean, they were able to engage with his writing because Dean was a bit of an LGBT blogger, which is why he's so articulate on some of these issues. "It's such a good feeling when nurses tell me they see their gay friends sharing my blog posts online, and my doctors have been setting my writing as compulsory reading for med students. Despite being in chemo, it's put me in such a good mood." So I really like to include that last quote because there are things going on around higher education and professional education, which is becoming much more LGBT inclusive. And this story of Dean's is one of the examples that often gets shared to illustrate these points. So coming back to health inequalities, LGBT people are disproportionately affected by cancer risk factors. And anybody who knows anything about cancer risk factors will know that some of them are around lifestyle choices. So we have higher rates of smoking in the LGBT community, higher rates of drinking. We have obesity, including evidence of eating disorders such as bulimia, and of course, mental health problems and suicide. And there are many publications out there that will identify and articulate some of those health inequalities, which do add up to quite significant cancer risk factors. And of course, it says at the bottom there that some of these risk factors, including smoking, do have an effect on the efficacy of cancer treatments, which means that it might make them work less effectively. So it's really important that we tackle things at the point where we can have an impact on people's lifestyle choices and reduce the risk of cancer. Now, this can be quite a tricky concept for people to get their heads around, and it doesn't just apply to the LGBT community, but could apply to any of the protected characteristics under the Equalities Act. And this is really trying to investigate why these health inequalities might exist. And the term that's used is this term minority stress. And on the slide there, it says minority stress is the relationship between the minority and the dominant values and the resulting conflict within the social environment experienced by minority group members. And I guess the idea here is we've heard about some of the legal protections won by the LGBT community in the last presentation, but legal protections don't necessarily bring immediate social equality. And there is a lingering sense amongst LGBT people, particularly those that have lived through periods of discrimination, that they are still in a minority group and have minority values and are not necessarily seen on an equal footing to the mainstream. And that's a sense of minority stress. That induces anxiety, which creates stress, and that stress is called minority stress. And these stresses can cause adverse health outcomes and might be some of the precursors that trigger the poor lifestyle choices, such as more smoking, more alcohol, and so on and so forth that I just spoke about. So there is this undercurrent throughout health amongst LGBT people of an anxiety that we're calling minority stress, that means they're always starting from a different point to everybody else, and that things that people can normally cope with, if you add the minority stress into it, become things that you then can't cope with. And that's a classic example of a health inequality and a difficulty that is encountered by LGBT people. And added into that, we have this idea of intersectionality, which we touched on again in the previous presentation, the idea that you're not just LGBT in isolation, and that's the only characteristic you have as a person, but of course, you are also possibly a single parent, or you could be from a BME group, or you could be from a low social economic group, and so on and so forth. And they're all factors that contribute to your identity, your presentation, and the potential for health inequalities. And the example that's given on this slide here, this is not a real example, this is a made-up example, but I think it's a good one. I'm a Black lesbian mother and I suffer from clinical depression. I am isolated because of the different levels of discrimination due to my race, sexuality, mental health problems, and single mother status. Health workers tend to take the culturally sensitive approach and will expect me to fit in the Black community, who are often homophobic, as most family help is centered around religious organizations. If they know my sexuality, they may feel LGBT organizations are appropriate, but none deal with the combination of mental health, families, and race. My own family believe homosexuality is a result of mental illness. And that illustrates this idea of intersectionality and why we need to take an intersectional approach to all of our work around health inequalities. So moving on to the next slide. Oops, I've clicked it too much there. Let's just go back one. It's not going. Oh, there we are. That's great. Okay, so the next few slides are some of the documents that hopefully you can find under your own steam that talk about inequalities faced by LGBT people at different points in the cancer pathway. So there isn't time this morning to go into huge amounts of detail on each one because they're quite involved. But just to give you an overview, there was an excellent report here from Marie Curie entitled "Hiding Who I Am," which is about end of life for LGBT people, and the list of items bullet pointed on the slide there. Oh, no, I didn't do that. Someone else is nudging my slides there. I want to go back. Go back. No, I can't go back. Here we go. We're going back. We're going back. Put a sneak preview then of everything that's coming up. Where is it gone? Well, I don't know what's happened to that slide from the Marie Curie there. It seems to have vanished, but maybe we'll come across it in a minute. Yeah, I'm clicking forward on these slides and it's not necessarily going to the next one, so just be
Would you
mindful
like
of that
Adrian
as
to
we
do
go
your
forward.
slides for you, Ben?
Well, I'm not touching anything and they're moving of their own accord, so that
We
might
love
be a good
technology.
idea.
If you need Adrian to step in, just kind of let us know when Adrian can take over the controls.
Yeah, I'll just say next slide, please. I think it would be easier at this point because it's not doing what I think it's
Adrian,
doing.
can you step in and then take control again, please?
Anyway, while we're doing that, I'll continue to talk about this slide that's on the screen at the moment. No problem at all, it's fine. So this one is your De Montfort University research project that was done by Professor Julie Fish a few years ago. And it's improving the cancer journey for lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans people. And this is a really, really good report that I strongly recommend you get a copy of if you can. The highlights from the research are on the slide here. The researchers found a significant number of participants disclosed their sexual orientation had a more positive experience of cancer services as a result. And the recommendations are to implement sexual orientation and gender monitoring in oncology. Now I'm going to come on to that towards the end of the presentation and tell you how you can achieve that, because that really is a fundamental part of how I'd like people to move forward around LGBT and cancer. Another point that they made, which I thought was extremely appropriate, is around creating environments in which LGBT patients feel comfortable to disclose their sexual orientation, and not just physical environments, but environments where they feel that they're going to be listened to by staff and that they can trust the staff, because there are lots of issues around discrimination and the potential for discrimination amongst healthcare staff, which has been found by other reports that we'll come on to. And of course, the old education and training there for healthcare professionals, which comes up every time for many, many issues. And I don't think there's many people who have done any specific education and training around LGBT and cancer, although there is some available if people want to contact me directly around that in the future. So next slide, please. Lovely, thank you. So this is More Than a Diagnosis, promoting good outcomes in LGB cancer care. So we're missing the T in this particular report, and this follows on from the previous one. So it's the same team that did this one, that did the previous report. So again, some commonalities and some really interesting and valid results from this study. Mentioned about managing the worry. So coming back to the idea of minority stress there, is it safe to disclose sexual orientation to professionals? What's the reaction you're going to get from people? Will you uncover bigotry and homophobia amongst NHS staff or social care staff if you disclose that you're LGB? And that's a real problem for people. This idea that you don't come out once, you come out every time you meet somebody as an LGB person, and that can cause a lot of anxiety and stress for people. Even in cancer centres of excellence, so few visible signs of inclusion for LGB cancer patients. I include the Christie in that because we don't have any visible signs of inclusion for LGB patients at the Christie Hospital at the moment. And it's only in the last 12 months that we've set up a LGBT plus staff group and move forward with an equalities agenda that includes LGBT patients. And that's been a big bugbear of mine. I've worked at the Christie for a decade and seen very little movement on this, but things have started to move forward, which is great. Now, I think it's a different situation at some of our other big hospitals in Manchester, MRI in Salford and whatnot. I think they're probably a little bit further on than we are, and they see probably more LGBT patients on balance at those organisations, which will be a driver for that, which I think is really interesting and probably the topic for another presentation. Lack of LGBT support groups in the UK. Now, there are some. For example, there is one called Out with Prostate Cancer for men who identify as gay or bisexual and are also affected by prostate cancer, but there aren't many. And one of the problems is, particularly with the older generation, LGB people attending what you might describe as mainstream peer support groups may encounter prejudice, homophobia, transphobia from members, and therefore aren't massively inclined to put themselves forward, when in fact it could be hugely beneficial for them, because we know that support groups are very effective for people, particularly in the survivorship section of the cancer pathway. Next slide, please. We can skip this one because I think we've done it. Okay, so I touched on the idea of discrimination in healthcare. And I'm going to go into more detail here. So this is a report from Stonewall, who are a brilliant organisation and have received a lot of flack in the press recently around their trans advocacy. But I would strongly recommend that you have a look at this document they released called Unhealthy Attitudes. And some of the figures in this are so shocking that I did question the accuracy of the report, I have to say. But on reflection, I wonder if it is a fair summary of some of the discrimination exhibited by health and social care staff across the country. And perhaps we are in a bit of a bubble in Manchester, where we perhaps are, ahead of the curve in terms of tackling some of these issues. But we have, for example, 57% of staff with direct responsibility for patient care do not think that sexual orientation is relevant to one's health needs. Now, I don't know how on earth anybody working in health and social care, particularly following HIV, could think that sexual orientation is not relevant to someone's health needs. I really don't know, but there we go. And 10% say they do not feel equipped to deal with the specific needs of LGB patients. In the past 5 years, 24% of patient-facing staff, they've heard colleagues making negative remarks around LGB people. I mean, that's, a quarter of patient-facing staff across the NHS and beyond commenting that they've heard negativity around LGB. I mean, it's completely unacceptable and far higher than I would have anticipated. We've got 72% of staff not receiving any training on the needs of LGBT people. Well, I think that is something we can easily address, and not a surprise. And 10% of staff have heard a colleague express the view that LGBT people can be cured of their sexual orientation. And we've already had the discussion this morning, haven't we, around the legal situation around gay cures and how that is being kicked down the road by the current government for whatever reason, and really does need to be challenged, because we can't continue with a situation where LGBT people are being potentially coerced into availing themselves of that type of therapy. Next slide, please. So positive stuff now. We've just had some negative stuff, but positive stuff. We've got a government LGBT action plan from July 2018, and this is still very valid. And it was the largest survey of its kind done anywhere in the world. So if you want to pick up a copy of this and have a little look as to where we are trying to head kind of nationally around LGBT and health, then do have a look at this document. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's the evidence base. Now we're going to talk around some of the key issues affecting LGBT plus and cancer care. And again, there probably isn't time this morning to go into detail on all of these areas of concern, but there are health inequalities across the board in the cancer pathway linked to being LGBT. And these are some of the areas in which it's most prevalent. Now, I've already mentioned behavioural risk factors, things like smoking cessation and whatnot, so that's in there. I've already mentioned trust in healthcare staff, so that's in there. Care and support structures is really linked to LGBT families and how they're not necessarily traditional family structures. And also we've got limited access to peer support, which I've already mentioned, which is in parallel with the care and support structures. Psychosexual function, that is to do with managing late consequences of treatment, and particularly pertains to people who aren't getting the right information to enjoy the sex that they want following cancer treatments. So for example, if you've had pelvic radiotherapy or some chemotherapy treatments, and linked to that we have fertility considerations, which if you recall I mentioned when I talked about Dean at the start of the presentation and his case study. We've got anatomical differences, which won't be a surprise at all, because we're including trans people who may have had surgeries as part of their change of gender, and physiological differences, again linked to that for trans people, hormones. And if you remember, we had Alan Turing mentioned a few minutes ago with his chemical castration. That's another thing that you might want to put into that category. Screening needs uptake and provision. It is true that some LGBT people feel that they don't need to come for screening For example, lesbians don't tend to turn up for cervical screening because they think they don't need it because they don't have sex with men. And that's a bit of an old wives' tale that's been going around for a long time. And we do need to be encouraging lesbians and bisexual women to turn up for cervical screening, of course, because they can be affected by cervical cancer. Heteronormative and cisnormative patient information is prevalent everywhere, and I do spend quite a lot of my time reviewing documents for people like Prostate Cancer UK, Macmillan, and so on and so forth, to try and create more inclusive patient information for LGBT people. And it's easily done, but not often thought about by those organisations as readily as we might like. And last but by no means least, just referring back to the Stonewall report there, staff attitudes, bigotry, prejudice needs to be tackled with a zero tolerance approach across the NHS. Next slide, please. Okay, so how do we address some of these inequalities? I'm going to rattle through this section really quickly. This is the time to make a few notes. If you've got any questions, do hold back and we'll tackle those at the end. So next slide, please. So monitoring. Monitoring is absolutely critical. Now, we monitor for other protected characteristics all the time, and we don't give it a second thought. Things like race, things like age. We don't necessarily monitor for sexual orientation and gender identity appropriately. And we need to start doing that, because if you are not counted, you don't count. And to start us on the journey of monitoring, we have the Sexual Orientation Monitoring Information Standard, which went live in 2017, which affords us a mechanism for appropriately monitoring patients' sexual orientation. This applies to any service, not just cancer care. And I use this all the time for audits, for projects, for get-togethers with patients, whatever. You can embed this monitoring in everything that you do. Next slide, please. So this is what the standard actually says. It's rather complicated, so I'm not going to go through this verbatim, but you can have a look at this at a later time, and it's simplified on the next slide. Hopefully. Yes, it is. Great. Which of the following options best describes how you think of yourself? So these are the categories that you should include if you are going to do sexual orientation monitoring. And obviously, you want to include heterosexual or straight, tick box. Now, gay or lesbian together, tick box. Bisexual, tick box, or in another way. Now, the reason why we've got gay and lesbian together is, of course, this is not a gender monitoring question. This is a sexual orientation monitoring question. So that's why we have heterosexual straight, we have gay and lesbian together, and we have bisexual. And there will be patients who want to write something in another way box. They might want to write pansexual, they might want to write asexual, or they might want to write something else, and that's absolutely fine. Again, we haven't got time to go into the ins and outs of how people identify beyond the kind of three or four big categories just there, and neither will you in the context of monitoring effectively in services. So just stick to those four categories. And I do not advise you to put prefer not to say, because you'll find that people will get shy and tick prefer not to say, which kind of defeats the whole object of monitoring sexual orientation. What we're trying to do here is normalize the monitoring of sexual orientation rather than making it stand out by saying, oh, it's such a difficult question, I prefer not to say. And of course, it's all going to be anonymized at the end of the day, a lot of this data, isn't it? Or it's going to be confidential. So there's absolutely no reason why people should be ticking a prefer not to say box. But some of you may feel differently about that. Next slide, please. What about trans status monitoring? So we've discussed sexual orientation, and now we're moving into gender identity. So in order to monitor trans status, you have to have two questions. The first question is the multiple choice question about gender. Now, you'll already be monitoring gender because you'll have, are you a man or a woman, probably on your monitoring form. And that question doesn't have to stay in. This question can go in instead of that. And it's very, very simple. It's just more inclusive. So which of the following best describes your gender? Man, including trans man, woman, including trans woman, non-binary, which I'll explain in a moment, or in another way. Now, non-binary refers to people who don't identify necessarily as a trans man or a trans woman, or a man or a woman, and have some other way of presenting their gender, and it can be a static presentation or it could be a fluid presentation. And I think if anybody wants to find out a bit more about what a non-binary gender identity might be like, it's best to think about two sliding scales of masculinity and femininity, where 0 is no masculinity or femininity and 100 is full masculinity or femininity. And a non-binary person might have the scale on the masculine line, say at 30%, and the scale on the female line at 70%. And that might be how they kind of present. So they kind of getting 70% female, 30% male, that sort of thing. Or it could be at a different point on either of those two scales. So we're kind of getting into the world of androgyny a little bit there. You know, you might be a bit more familiar with that word. But there are lots of non-binary people around, and there are lots of famous people that identify as non-binary. And if you can think of any, please do put them in the chat right now, and we can see how many famous non-binary people we can think of off the top of our head. And while you're doing that, I'll talk about the next question, which is to do with trans status. So the first question is asking you your gender identity, but it's not identifying who is trans in the room. So you also have to ask if the gender that you were assigned at birth is the same as your current gender, because if the answer is no, that means that you are trans. And if the answer is yes, that means you are cisgender, which means the same, which means you are not trans. So that question is, again, a very, very simple yes or no, and identifies who is trans in the room. Next slide, please. So it's very, very simple. Here's a project I did a few years ago at the Christie to do with late consequences of cancer treatment and an online portal. And as part of the gender monitoring, we included a question there which has those categories in it in a drop-down box, and you can see how simple it is. You just select which one you are and off you go, and it's as simple as that. Next slide, please. So why are we doing it? I think I've mentioned a few reasons why we need to do monitoring already, but just to reiterate, there are plenty of good reasons to monitor LGBT in health. And supports good practice, mitigates risk, better understands the numbers of LGBT people who are using your services. It can inform how the service is seen by those people and inform your service improvement projects, and helps to build equity of access and opportunity. And last but no means least, someone's put in cost savings there. And I would like to know why that's in there, because I can't think of any cost savings off the top of my head. But if anyone's got any bright ideas how monitoring might help save costs, then that's going to be a gold star for you today, because it's all about saving money, isn't it, at the moment? Next slide, please. So, putting research into practice. We've talked about monitoring. Monitoring is something you can do easily. But another thing you can do to reduce health inequalities for LGBT people is to put research into practice. And there has been quite recently a bit of activity around researching this topic area, and there are now things in the world that will help guide us in how we can improve our services. And one of those examples is on this slide, and this is to do with advice for gay and bisexual men following pelvic radiotherapy. So I spoke a bit earlier on about psychosexual health related to cancer treatment, and that will involve a conversation with the patient around their sex life and how cancer and its treatments might impact negatively their sex life going forward, either through treatment or after treatment. And if you are a heterosexual person, then that conversation is tricky at the best of times. If you are a gay or bisexual man, that conversation is going to be even more challenging, because it might involve talking about anal sex, which is something that gay and bisexual men sometimes do as part of their sex life. And one of the questions that you're likely to be asked is, how long should I abstain from receiving anal sex following radiotherapy to the pelvis? And many a healthcare professional has been stumped, I suspect, by that question in the past. but there is now a piece of research which illustrates the correct response and how we shouldn't be shy of tackling some of these questions, because the message very much is, if the healthcare professional doesn't broach it, the patient definitely won't. It's very unlikely that the patient's going to start asking about abstaining from anal sex unless the health professional opens the door to talking about sexual health following treatment. That's what the research is telling us. But most healthcare professionals don't go there because either they're shy, they don't want to talk about anal sex because they're embarrassed, or they just don't know the answer. So here is the answer. I won't go into the details as to what's on the slide there, but you can pick up a copy of A Guide for Gay and Bisexual Men from Prostate Cancer UK, which is a really good starting point for healthcare professionals. And those of you who are involved in literature searches and all the rest of it can dig out the study, which does result in this little graphic here with these lovely statements about how long people should abstain from anal sex, which is very, very helpful if you're involved in that area of work. Next slide, please. So we've talked about putting research into practice. We've talked about monitoring. I'm going to talk about promoting diversity and inclusion now, and challenging staff to think differently. So this is something we can all do in any organization, and we're hearing so much about this in the news at the moment, mostly in relation to BME communities, of course, but the same thing does apply to LGBT. And I have to say that after the Black Lives Matter movement last year, I've seen a real sense of momentum gathering around diversity and inclusion, perhaps more so than we've had for quite some time, which is really, really positive. And now is the time to grab the bull by the horns within your respective organizations and say, what are we doing to promote diversity and inclusion and reduce health inequalities? And can we put some action plans together to to actually take some proper steps forward and measurable steps forward? That's what I'm trying to say. Now, these are some of the questions that I think you could be asking within your organizations, specifically around LGBT, but also more generally to celebrate diversity. So how can we create inclusive spaces for person-centered care? Is there anything visible that says LGBT people are treated here and are welcome here, and we recognize that you are here? How can we celebrate diversity? I mean, an easy way to do that would be to say, can we do something for Pride? Can we do something with a rainbow logo on it? Simple things like putting up rainbow flags at Pride is just a classic thing to do that really is effective, and takes no time at all. How can we navigate complexities around conflicting staff attitudes and values? Now, this is a whole presentation on its own, I dare say, and is a very, very difficult area of work, particularly around the intersection between religion and LGBT. And again, this is something that I will probably have conversations in private with people about if you're having difficulties. But it is true that there are some conflicts between potentially very religious staff and people who identify as LGBT. And there's also a difficulty around what we call gender critical feminism and trans advocacy, which is to do with certain people who feel there is a primacy of biological sex, and therefore that negates gender identity, and that you can never really truly be a woman if you're also trans, or a man if you're also trans, because it's biologically impossible. And there is a huge debate going on, and a very nasty debate, I have to say, as well, around this issue on social media and in the wider world. And you'll find this is becoming a bit of a political football around trans people, and it feels almost as if it's reminiscent of the debate we had about gay people that we spoke about in the previous presentation from 20 years ago. Trans people are kind of in that space now. They're getting a lot of stick from the press, and they're not being able to self-identify, and so on and so forth. So that's a very, very difficult area of work. So if anyone's got any questions about that, I think that is either for later or another day, if that's okay. How is our organisation perceived by the LGBT community? Well, ask them. We do patient surveys all the time, don't we? Well, let's do something around LGBT specifically. Do some outreach work, have a stall at Pride, do something like that. Get out there and ask them, and you'll be surprised. Some of them will think you're absolutely brilliant, I'm sure of it. Do you inadvertently discriminate? So this is to do with not realising that you're discriminating. that you're in a very heteronormative or cis-normative environment and taking no action. Taking no action is inadvertently discriminating, in my opinion. So how do you get around that? Well, you can undertake a service equality review, a really structured review on how your service is performing, whether you're identifying any health inequalities in there. Is anyone doing any research around LGBT and your area of work? If they're not, why not? Are there any barriers to that? Are there funding issues? And last but by no means least, are LGBT staff visible within your organisation? Absolutely key. You probably will have some LGBT staff in your organisation. And if they're in the closet, or if they're hiding, if they can't be themselves, if they're quiet, how can you support them? I'm not talking about outing people publicly here. I'm talking about perhaps going back to the second point about celebrating our diversity and the first point about creating inclusive spaces. Perhaps those people could be empowered to take a role in doing that. And in doing so, you're supporting LGBT staff within your own organisation. Next slide, please. If you want to hear more stories about cancer and LGBT specifically, this is the place to go. It's all video clips, it's all people affected by cancer, and it's all really, really good stuff. I mean, it's gold. It's absolute gold. If you're working in cancer care and you want to hear about some of the challenges, then visit this. This was a Manchester University research project sponsored by Macmillan, and the website address is on the screen. Next slide, please. That's the end. Great. Elizabeth, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ben. That was so interesting and really just, yeah. I've got questions, but I'm not going to ask them. I can get my questions answered in shortly. Thank you so much. Ben's got about 5 minutes now for questions. Does anybody have a question for Ben at all? If you want, take yourself off mute and just ask away, or put your hand up if you want to. Adrian, could you just lose that so we can see who's on the screen? Does anybody have a question? Is there any hands up? You got off lightly, Ben.
I did, didn't I?
Lorraine has their hand up.
Oh, sorry, Go for it, Lorraine. I didn't see you on my screen.
No, it's all right. I did put my hand up quite late after you said it, so sorry. So Ben, yeah, that was a great presentation. So I work for the Caribbean and African Health Network. So you were saying with Pride, how would we go about getting a stall?
Okay, yeah, that's a really good question. So Manchester Pride happens at the end of August every year, assuming there's no COVID restrictions. And you can either be in the parade, which, as I'm sure you know, winds its way around the city centre on the Saturday afternoon, or they have something called the Lifestyle Expo, which happens under the multi-storey car park in the village. I can't remember the name of the road that's on at the moment. Either way, it's not free. So you'd have to have a budget for it, and I don't think it's cheap, but it's really worthwhile. I've had a stall as part of the LGBT Cancer Support Alliance under the multi-storey for a few years running, although we don't do that project anymore. And we had hundreds of contacts with people talking about cancer and various other health issues during that weekend. And we needed about 20 volunteers to pull it off. So it's not a small undertaking, but it is a valuable undertaking and well worth investigating. You would need to contact Pride directly through their website, the URL of which is not in my head at the moment, but I'm sure a quick Google will produce that. And it's probably a bit late in the day for this year.
Okay, thanks for your answer.
So I think that if anyone has any questions for Ben, in the follow-up email, there'll be an email address. Ben, are we okay to give your email address out, do you think?
Yeah, that's fine. Absolutely fine.
There you go. So if anyone has any questions for Ben, because sometimes we can't always think in the moment, if you have any questions for Ben or you'd like to contact Ben after the session, I'll send his email in the follow-up. So Adrian, could you put thanks again, Ben, that was absolutely fantastic.
I'm gonna have to go now, but it's nice to see you all. Yeah,
lovely to see you, and thanks again. And I know you've got to rush off, so thanks. If you disappear, we'll know that you've gone, but thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye. Could you put the presentation back
yeah,
up,
I will do. Just to draw people's attention, just in the chat box, Jess has made a really good point that there are loads of prides around Greater Manchester. There's Levenshulme Pride, there's lots of little local prides, Bolton Pride. So there will likely be one if you're kind of locality based. So do a quick Google. Jess is saying Salford, the Peel Park Pink Picnic. That's certainly one that's well established. So have a Google, because it's probably easier to get involved in a local pride than it might be with the bigger Greater Manchester Pride at this stage. So really good point. Right, let's go back to technology.
Thanks, Jess, and hello.
Right, Eva, are you showing on the screen there?
Yes.
Brilliant.
So next up, we've got Eva, who's one of our lead Answer Cancer champions. And Eva's just going to talk a bit about health services and her experiences within the LGBT plus community of accessing health. Eva's an activist, an ambassador, a blogger, and a spokesperson within the LGBT plus community, for the LGBT plus community and beyond. So if you just show the next slide, Adrian, because we've got because Eva sent us through some lovely pics. So without further ado, Adrian, should we take the slides off and just let Eva speak so everybody can see her, do you think, or do you think we should leave it on?
What would Eva prefer? Because Eva will pop up in the screen, so she'll pop up in the little window.
Yeah.
As well as being on the screen.
Okay. So over to you, Eva.
Hi everyone. My name's Eva Echo. My pronouns are she, her. Unfortunately, I don't have any fancy slides or presentations. So I'm just going to talk to you briefly about myself first, and then you'll hopefully understand how it fits into the healthcare side of things. I'm an activist, a blogger, and founder of the Pass It On campaign, which was created to raise awareness of trans and non-binary struggles, and also to give a platform to those without a voice. I'm also brand ambassador for the London Transgender Clinic. I'm part of Gendered Intelligence, which is a trans-led charity, as one of their activists and trans spokespeople. And because I like to keep busy, I'm also part of the Crown Prosecution Service's hate crime panel, where we come together regularly and we look at cases and prosecutions, challenge the judicial system, and basically make recommendations to improve how 5 strands of hate crime are dealt with. I should mention now that some of what I talk about contains discussion of topics which some people may find triggering, namely mental health and suicide. First and foremost, I am transgender, and I'm proud to be, but I never used to. I've spent a long time getting to where I am today. Don't let these looks deceive you. I am no spring chicken at all. I came out late on in life, following 36 years of denial, confusion, and fear. I knew at a very young age, though, that something wasn't quite right with me, that I didn't fit in, that I was different to the boys around me. I felt trapped and I didn't know how to articulate it. At this point, I should state that not everyone realizes that they're trans or non-binary from a young age, though a large percentage do. Around the time when a child is typically self-aware is when it happens. But there are those who don't realize until adulthood, and that's okay. It doesn't make them any less transgender. So, coming from a very traditional Chinese family, I had no choice but to bury all of my feelings, even from a young age. When puberty hit, it hit hard, and my life went from bad to worse. It was like being a spectator to my own life. I was just there for the ride, and I had no say about the destination. I was just literally screaming on the inside, having to pretend on the outside. Puberty is extremely difficult for any trans person that is self-aware about their gender identity at that time. And sadly, the effects of puberty are irreversible, leaving many suffering from gender dysphoria in adult life. And for some, it's not always straight away. By the way, for those who aren't aware, gender dysphoria is the unease a person feels when their gender identity doesn't match the sex that they were assigned with at birth. Gender identity and sexuality are both 2 separate things. And until 2019, gender dysphoria was still classified as a mental health disorder. I mean, let's face it, who would choose to change their gender, right? It was seen as a crazy thing at that time. But it isn't, not when you understand. And the thing is, nobody knows what causes gender dysphoria, but it is now recognized as a medical condition. There have been many studies about what causes it and why, but none have proved conclusive. But nobody chooses to be transgender or non-binary. I mean, let's face it, who would put themselves voluntarily at the risk of verbal abuse, physical violence, discrimination, and sadly, in some cases, even death? We just exist. We just are. It's impossible to fully explain how gender dysphoria affects a person because every experience is very individual. There's no one way to be trans, just in the same way that there's no one way for each of you to exist. Whatever you read in the media about trans kids not being able to make decisions for themselves about who they are, I would say it's not the full story. It's just a one-sided press with its own agenda, unfortunately. I know trans kids are capable of knowing who they are because I was one and I'm here. It's not a phase, or it's not anybody forcing me to be this way. So anyway, puberty came to stay, unfortunately, and my mental health began to suffer. I was bullied at school too, which really didn't help. At the age of 17 or 18, I developed an eating disorder. I also started self-harming, and I even attempted suicide a few times. I thought that this descent into mental health turmoil was because of the bullying and a broken relationship with my biological family. I used it all as a method of denial, basically, pretending that the real issue was that in order to avoid the really obvious one. Even after years of therapy, depression, continued self-harm and suicide attempts plaguing most of my adult life, it wasn't until recently that everything clicked. That's the power of denial. I allowed myself to think honestly. The control I needed wasn't because I had been bullied or had no relationship with my parents. Yeah, those things didn't help, but it was me needing control over my own body, my own direction. At first, I felt like a criminal, even trying to unpack certain things about why I always wanted to wear a dress and not trousers. It was difficult not to feel like a criminal because we live in a society where things are gendered. Blue for boys, pink for girls, or trousers for boys, dresses for girls. Everything's so focused on gender. There's even gender reveal parties these days. What is the big obsession with fitting everything into, one or another? We're taught from a young age not to question these rules though, and we just simply follow them. But who said that they were right to begin with? So anyway, I did something which many trans people do throughout my life. I went to the extreme. So yeah, that's right. I thought if I'm not a woman, I am going to be as manly as possible. I adopted a role. I looked at what other men were doing and I did my best to join in. Unfortunately, I never lasted long. For a start, I absolutely hate beer and sport. Each time that I hit rock bottom though, when feelings about my gender identity came back to the surface, I realized I was living a lie. I would try suicide or resort to self-harm, taking it out on myself to try and distract myself from everything that's going on inside my head. But then after that, I'd simply pick myself up and pretend again, but this time a different type of manliness. And this vicious cycle is how I spent my adult life, hitting a dead end, resetting, only to hit another dead end. The power of denial and a society that doesn't accept. And I'm a result of that. For me, not being able to convey how I was feeling was a huge reason why I was quite detached from those around me. I found it difficult to form relationships of any level and often spent time alone. In the back of my mind, I just kept thinking, I'm a freak. Nobody would ever understand or want me. I only had to look at how other marginalized groups were being treated by society to know that I would never be accepted as my authentic self. And so I hid. When I did come out 4 years ago, it was out of necessity. I could not continue pretending I was simply living a lie. And if anything, I'd run out of manly roles to play. Nothing suited me. And now, whilst my mental health is not 100%, let's face it, is anybody's ever 100%? I can certainly say it's nowhere near as bad as it was before coming out, and I can finally see myself growing old and enjoying life. I mean, since coming out, I've dedicated my energy to creating change so that gender diverse people can feel accepted and to have the emotional and mental support that we need. So here I am, after spending years learning to accept myself and trying to find my place in the world. And I won't lie, it has been one hell of a struggle, one that's caused depression, multiple suicide attempts, and even an eating disorder for most of my adult life. But I'm through nearly all of that now, and I've come to terms with who I am, even if others haven't. So why have I chosen to share my lived experience with you today? Well, I don't have any fancy slides, but also because letting people in and helping people to understand what it is to be transgender is what will ultimately save us. After speaking to my followers on social media, it's clear that not all of us get the support we need from our own GPs, with many being refused a referral to a gender clinic or being misgendered or even dead named. The really shocking reality is that not every GP is on the same page. Not all of them even know how to deal with a trans patient, let alone the best practice for referring to a gender clinic or how to change a trans patient's medical records over. Therefore, consistency and education is absolutely vital. I've been working alongside Anti-Cancer now for the past 9 months or so to increase the take-up of cancer screening within the trans and non-binary community. It was going really well, but I quickly realised it goes way beyond that. It's all very well getting people to attend screenings, but are those screenings going to accommodate gender diverse people when we get there? Can people like me turn up to a safe and inclusive space knowing that we won't be judged? I mean, we live in a progressive society, but there are fundamental flaws when it comes to diversity and inclusion within organisations and practices. Why? Well, because it's an afterthought to a system that's already been built. Diversity and inclusion were never fully a part of society's foundations due to a number of historical factors. And it's only in recent times that we've started to try and retrospectively fix things. To create long-lasting change, though, we need to be going back to basics, stripping everything apart to then build back better, to steal some blonde guy's phrase. Only we'll do it properly because we take the time to understand and to learn. Gender diverse people spend a lifetime wrestling with inner conflicts and suffer all sorts of social issues just simply to exist, just to be accepted. Now, receiving a letter about screening is like somebody saying, I know you've worked really hard to get to where you are, but, and that but is deeply upsetting. It reminds me of the time when, for me personally, I was doing my GCSEs and I was bullied so much at school that I couldn't focus. I was too scared to ask for help, sorry. I couldn't even raise my hand in class because I didn't want to be singled out. I didn't want my classmates to call me stupid. So I just sat there, literally winging it through each lesson, convinced that I was going to fail my GCSEs spectacularly and disappoint my family, especially my dad, who was always very demanding and demanded more than any of us could give. I even secretly enrolled at my local college to do A-levels, thinking that if I failed him, I could try and save the moment by letting him know that I did have a backup plan. I wasn't a failure. Thing is, I didn't fail though. I got 7 A's and 2 B's in my GCSEs, and I was shocked and relieved. I couldn't wait to tell my dad when he got home from work. And his reaction? Why couldn't you make those 2 B's into 2 A's? Then you'd have 9 A's. And in that moment, I'd gone from feeling like I'd got somewhere in life to being told it didn't really matter. For me, a letter for cancer screening is my dad. As a trans person, being told you have to go for certain screenings, it's like being told you'll never fully be a man or a woman. We get told that by transphobes, gender critics, virtually every day when they hound us, they throw hate at us, they troll us. The last thing we need is a health service to tell us the same thing. Now, I know it's not meant to come across like that. It's not meant to be transphobic or it's not meant to upset anybody. After all, it's just a letter. It's just a service. But that's how it feels. That's how it comes across. And going back to the previous presentation, that's why it's so important to make sure everything, including literature, is fully inclusive. Judging from the responses from our recent nationwide survey amongst trans and non-binary people, that's also how a lot of people feel as well. That's why many don't bother with the letter and just ignore it. Or if they've made an appointment, the anxiety and the dysphoria becomes so overwhelming, they simply don't show up. And it's a scenario that's costing lives and the NHS in time. After all, that appointment could be gone to somebody else, give someone else that chance to have a screening, somebody that would want to turn up. But what about trans and non-binary patients? Nobody ever stops to consider why we don't turn up. If anything, we just get left behind. See, trans people are a curious and cautious community. We can be so cynical or so defensive because we're forced to be. We can't really enjoy all that we've individually worked hard to achieve because we fear being laughed at, abandoned by our own families, criticised in the press, accused of using the wrong toilet for the wrong reasons, and labelled as sexual predators or fetishists. I can tell you now, a gender diverse person will be wondering all sorts when it comes to cancer screening. How will I be treated in a waiting room? How will I be treated by the screening technician? Will anybody understand what it is to be diverse? Will the language used be inclusive of me as well? Simply, will there be any transphobia? Imagine being a trans man going for cervical screening. Imagine how you must feel knowing that just being there outs you to everyone. You may as well have a target painted on you. And the sad truth is that gender diverse people do get singled out and targeted for abuse, and that's why we have to be cautious. The very happiness and euphoria that we spent our lives trying to achieve can be taken away just like that in a single moment. Having to undress, having to show your body is always anxiety inducing. Unless you're incredibly confident, in which case I'll be asking you for some tips and advice after this. Even without gender dysphoria though, even cisgender people have hang-ups about their own bodies, and that's no thanks to the media. Whether it's not being the right shape or proportions, etc. I bet most of you could reel off a list of things you don't like about yourselves before you can tell me one thing that you do like. But what about trans people who have spent the majority of their life hating the bodies they were born with, the very bodies that they were once a spectator in? As a trans person, having to show yourself to a complete stranger who may not understand you is top-level anxiety. Frontline staff and clinicians may understand us, but we don't know that. We don't know what we're walking into. And that's why things like normalizing the use of pronouns or actively being an ally is absolutely crucial in breaking down those barriers. When I had breast augmentation, I found it to be squeaky bum time, even just knowing that I had to take my top off during a post-op appointment. I was incredibly nervous. And the thing is, the person I was taking my top off to is one of the world's most renowned specialist surgeons for trans patients. If I'm nervous around a person who understands trans people, what am I going to be like around someone who doesn't? I mean, with non-binary people, it goes beyond that. Non-binary identities are still so misunderstood, with many non-binary people having to constantly explain to everyone who they are and why they're non-binary, effectively coming out over and over again because of a lack of awareness, or in some cases, ignorance. If there is anything that I would ask for you to take away from my ramblings, it's this. Gender diverse people need allies. We need you. Nobody knows really how many of us there are in the UK because many are too afraid to exist visibly because of the actions of others. The only real estimate is that 1% of the population is transgender. Possibly more now, due to activism, increased awareness, and more people leading the way for others. And though we're a minority group, we're still human. Cancer doesn't pick or choose. It doesn't care about our gender identity. I am just as much on cancer's potential hit list as any of you. So as an ally, please do all you can to include us. It doesn't have to be trans people changing the world for trans people. You can make a difference too. You don't have to bend over backwards to make that change happen either. Just using the right language or challenging current processes to make sure they're inclusive, challenging colleagues, things like that can make a huge difference to our lives. There's still so much work that needs to be done to bridge the gap and to bring both sides together so that lives can be saved through early detection. This is bigger than any of us, and that's why we all need to be on the same team, supporting each other so that cancer does not win. Thank you. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask away. Before you do though, I just want to say that not every trans or non-binary person that you meet is happy to open up about their lives. So please don't expect everyone you meet to readily share intimate elements about themselves, especially when you've never met them before. Remember, we are a cautious community. I put myself out there to be asked the inappropriate questions, so others who perhaps are more private or more vulnerable, they don't have to face those questions, but we can all still learn. Plus, my life's all over the media anyway, so it makes absolutely no difference to me. I'm used to it. But please be respectful when talking to gender diverse people. So yeah, if you've got any questions, feel free to shout them out.
Thank you so much, Eva. That was so powerful and so moving. You've kind of took my breath away. I'm still processing a lot of the information you gave us there. That's a lot of information. So yeah, thank you so much. We've only got 5 minutes of questions for Eva because we've kind of run over on time. So if anyone has a question for her, put your hand up, ask it. Oh, Jessica's got one. Just if you can't take yourself off mute by now, Jess, there you go.
I've done it. I've unmuted myself.
Yay.
Well, Eva, thank you so much for sharing your presentation. Really good, really very open to sharing your experiences and all the challenges that you've been through. I suppose you've talked about being a Chinese woman from a very traditional Chinese community. So obviously there's still massive barriers within BAME communities for trans people. So how has your experience been about being a trans woman and sharing your story being received from BAME communities?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we all need to recognize. Luckily for me, I have got used to it. I shouldn't have to get used to it, but yeah, I mean, the issue I face, one of the biggest issues, that I'm fetishized all over my social media. Some people trying to slip into my DMs, the things that people think it's okay to ask me or to say to me because I am trans and I'm Chinese, and because people see me as this object. It's degrading. And it makes me realize that this happens to so many more people. It's not just about me. It happens to all, trans people. And for some reason, trans people are fetishized, and there's very little we can do about that. But we can educate. We can show people that we aren't the fetish, that we are just people as well. And one of the barriers I face is trying to get people to move away from old ways of thinking. I mean, even when I came out to my parents, I mean, I don't have any relationship with my parents, but I told them, they were in fact the last in the world to know. I told them as a courtesy. And even when I told my mom, her reaction was basically, what, like in Thailand? And I'm like, no, nothing like that, not a lady boy. And it just goes to show that there is so little understanding, and that we really need to work harder to educate. I know that there are traditions, and where I'm living now is quite a traditional sort of little area, and that's fine. And I say to people, it's okay to hold on to your traditions, but don't let them drag you down. Don't get to a point where the rest of the world has moved on and you're still hugging this tradition. It's okay to acknowledge and move on, and always remember, the roots and the history.
Thanks, Eva, that's great.
Thanks, Jess. I'm just mindful of our time. Eva, check the comments, because people have just got nothing but love for you in the comments, and just such lovely comments that people are posting. Thank you so much. If anyone has a question for Eva, if after the session, they can email to me and I will forward them on to Eva. I'm not going to share your address because you're a private citizen, as we say. So, but if you've got any questions for Eva after the session, email them to me and I'll be sure that she gets them, and I'm sure you'll respond accordingly.
Yeah, I did say, if anybody needs any further information and anybody wants to schedule a meeting to discuss anything that might benefit their own organisation, or even just help themselves to understand better, feel free to reach out. I am Googleable and my blog is online. So yeah, I'm here to help and create change.
I'm going to check out your blog because yeah, thank you so much, and such powerful testimony that you give us today, such a powerful moving story, and from your own personal experience. Adrian, Thank you so much. I'm just going to move on with the rest of the presentation because we've only got about 10 minutes or so left to get through. Woof! We're just going to skip bits now, I think. So Adrian, what's the next bit? We've done that bit. Next one. Is Donna here? Donna, if you want to take yourself off mute, and Donna, there you go.
Yeah, I am here.
Hi. Next, we've got an update from Donna, who is going to tell you a little bit about our engagement and delivery team, just some plans moving forward, because today's kind of a big day following on from yesterday. So over to you,
Okay.
Donna. Thank you.
Thank you. There's one slide that I've sent you. I don't know if you can...
I didn't get it yesterday. I've not got it this morning. I don't know who...
Right, fine. Okay.
You could just say it.
Okay, fine. Right, so good afternoon, everyone. I don't know how I'm supposed to follow that, you know, but I will do my best, okay? I've been invited to give a bit of an overview about the work of the engagement team at Answer Cancer. So my name is Donna Miller. I'm the Director of Policy Engagement and Development at BHA for Equality, and BHA is the partner that leads on delivering awareness sessions and community outreach activities for Answer Cancer. So last year was quite a challenging year, and I think it was a challenging year for, you know, quite a lot of voluntary and community organisations having to try and engage with their service users or members of the public during a pandemic. So obviously it had a significant impact on the work that we actually do in the community. It resulted in less face-to-face contact with community organisations, and, you know, as with other organisations, trying to shift our services online, and at the same time try and create that sort of relationship with organisations as well. The impact of that shift from public-facing to online meant that we actually ended up delivering a lot less sessions. But, you know, we were in the midst of a pandemic. Other people have, you know, a lot of other priorities and challenges that they had to deal with. So in many ways that was expected. But even so, you know, for those organisations that were able to offer sessions to, we did. We also then tried to identify different ways of engaging with the community sector and also members of the public. So we did things, for example, like we decided to produce a newsletter. So that was one way of getting key messages out about cancer to different communities. We tried to link into community radio stations, and we also linked into various food banks as well, because obviously during the pandemic, you know, with the difficulties that many people were facing, food banks or food hubs, you know, were a key way of them actually surviving the struggles that they were going through. So that was one way of tapping into quite a number of people. The priority areas for us over last year were Manchester, Salford, Oldham, Haywood, Middleton, Rochdale, and Bolton. So 5 localities that we actually gave priority to. Those areas were a priority because they are areas where there's low uptake of screening. And in terms of the priority groups for engagement, we work with Black, Asian and other minority groups. We work with people who are carers, people with poor mental health, people with a disability, people who identify as LGBTQ+, and people who live in deprived areas as well. So it's quite challenging what we actually do. We obviously need to adapt what we deliver to the various audiences. And I think 2 key projects that came out of our work last year was around the development of a program to actually support women who've actually been through FGM, to enable them to get access to cervical screening services. And additionally, we work in partnership with primary care networks and GPs within those primary care networks. And we have developed a program with a primary care network, the Robert Derbyshire Primary Care Network, and we'll be working with them to try and increase the uptake of cervical screening of Black, Asian and women of other minority groups in their particular area. So going into the future, we hope to go back to what we think we do best, actually meeting individuals face to face. We have actually already started that. We're taking a locality approach. A couple of weeks ago, we were up in Harper Hay. We had a stall on the market at Harper Hay, engaging with individuals, sharing key messages about cancer, and also, you know, working across the district shopping centre and just engaging with members of the public. I mean, that's an example of what we actually hope to do in other places across Greater Manchester as well. So, you know, in terms of our locality approach, I mean, just to sum up, we'll be visiting shopping centres, we'll be leafleting, if it's possible, we'll have a stall on the local market, we'll have a presence in local supermarkets, we'll be collaborating with GPs within those localities, we'll be using community radio stations, we'll be linking into local organisations as well in those areas to support our activity. And also getting involved in larger events like Pride was mentioned earlier. Hopefully we'll also be, well, not hopefully, we will be at the Caribbean Carnival and also the Mela as well, the Asian Mela. So I think that actually gives you a very quick overview of our plans for the future.
Thank you so much, Donna. Exciting times ahead. It's great to be getting back out there. It seems we've had such a long, it's been more than a year. I think it's been about 15 or 16 months, but it's been a long time. So what a great time now, sun shining, plans for the summer. So great. Thank you very much for sharing. And apologies I didn't get your slide. It just happened.
It's fine.
So, but thank you. So hopefully you'll find us somewhere out in Greater Manchester sometime this summer. And if you're an organisation or a group that are out and about, let us know where you are. So if there's any staff available, we could maybe come down and support, or just so we can promote on our website and get your messages out there and your events out there. So Adrian, could you just do the next slide for me? So I'm not going to go on to the next one, but please, if you can. The one before it, the plans one. So I'm not going to go through this at this time just because we're rushed for time, but for all our events, we do ask people, as part of the form filling, we ask people to make a plan. Just something that you've heard today, or you've learned today, or you thought about from today that you can take forward into your private life, your personal life, your work life, your community group. Just make a plan to share awareness with someone somewhere. There's some ideas for plans on the screen. Your plan doesn't have to be anything big, or it can be something very, very small. And I follow up the plans probably about 2 or 3 months from now. In the next quarter, I'll follow them up. So hopefully you'll have had a chance to complete your plan. We'll send out the link to the plan form when I do the follow-up. So when the next few links arrive, when the links arrive, there's 3 forms that you need to fill in. If you can go to the next one, Adrian, when the links arrive, be sure to complete them all. The next one is the equal opportunities form. Like Ben said, if you're not counted, you don't count. So be sure to fill in this equal opportunity form. It ensures that we get the data we need, so we know that we're getting out there into the communities we need to. And if you go on to the next one, Adrian. Okay, if you've not signed up to be an Answer Cancer Champion, we suggest that you do so. We want everybody who's here today to sign up to be a cancer champion. There's lots of advantages to being a champion. I'll send the link out. You can sign up, and then you'll get access to all the things that are online. Could you do the next one? Sorry to rush through these. I'm just mindful of the time, but you'll get the 3 links. Okay, so after today, you'll get the links, you'll get the presentations, and you can sign up to be an Answer Cancer Champion. If you need any additional help or support, email back, let us know. Also, if you've got any questions for any of the presenters today, email the questions over, we'll get them to them and they can get back to you. And when you're out and about this summer, include us, tag us into your activities by Facebook, Twitter, all the usual ones. Let us know what you do, share your successes with us. So over to you, Adrian, just for the finish. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Ben. I think Ben's gone. Thank you, Eva. A couple of maybe one theme which I'd kind of like to pick up kind of from your kind of own kind of story and from Ben's as well, and kind of use a couple of exhibits that were shown in the People's History Museum as kind of one way to kind of demonstrate that, and also very topical, of course. I found myself getting so involved in some of the football games for the first time, and I think there's a reason for that. Kind of first picture, kind of just kind of sharing with you there. That's of Justin Fashanu. He's the guy on the right hand side. He's next to his brother John, who some of you kind of may know. Justin was one of the first out Premier League footballers, or one of the first Premier League footballers to come out when he was kind of actually a player. I think we might have moved where there might be somebody else who's out and visible, but not playing kind of Premier League. But when Justin first came out, I mean, it's an understatement to say he had an awful time from the press, from the fans. His brother appeared a week later after Justin's story came out in The Sun. John appeared a week later in the Voice newspaper saying, "My brother is an outcast." But kind of to kind of move kind of from that story kind of, and the football boots you kind of see there, they're from an Everton football player, Browning, and they have the rainbow laces, which were part of a campaign that Stonewall kind of initiated. And then flipping forward to, was it last week? It feels like so long ago, last week or the week before in the kind of Euros, and that's Jordan Henderson. And you can't quite see it, but he's wearing rainbow laces there. And kind of, kind of some of the players wore rainbow armbands. And that's in his game against kind of Ukraine. And this kind of idea of visibility of kind of all of our stories kind of being told and heard, about representation, about kind of being seen, I think is kind of so important and has come across kind of all of the stories today, because kind of being seen is both kind of an expression of existence. It's kind of so important. It's something we all need. But it's also one of our greatest tools for change as well. And maybe kind of what I should have done is change that a little bit. So it's not just kind of, it's not our responsibility to be seen as members of different communities, but it's all of our responsibilities to see. So it's our responsibilities to see all of each other, of all of our communities. It's all of our responsibilities to kind of reach out, to be inclusive and to do something. So there are, Manchester is this amazing, creative, wonderful place with kind of resources, with groups, with people, and Sir Cancer can help kind of direct you there. So reach out if needed, be inclusive, and do something. Do something that enables others to be seen and to be involved as well. And that kind of feels like an appropriate place to kind of finish maybe kind of today. Thank you so much for kind of staying with us to the end and for your contributions as well. Elizabeth has said that all of this information's kind of been sent out. We have a break, so opportunities to go and do whatever you need to do. And then those of you who would like to, or who are able, hang around, because we have a Q&A kind of just a chat afterwards, a Q&A session, a chat place for you to share some of your stories, some of your kind of work as well. Thank you very much, Elizabeth, unsung hero. Thank you for all of this, for bringing it together, for the slide deck, for all of it. Thank you very much. Go enjoy your cup of tea, everyone. Thank you.
You've got to press start on that, Adrian, so we've got a clock to time down.
Oh, you want the start,
okay,
right?
So we've got 5 minutes now between our next Q&A session, just a quick 5-minute break. Oh, press start on can you see it on the bottom left?
Yeah, I can. There you go. Countdown has started.
There we go. Thank you. Cheers, Adrian. Thank you.
Elizabeth.
Hello.
I'm back on time.
Oh, I don't know how many we've got here. So, Answer Cancer staff, if anyone asks any questions and you're okay to answer them, that's great, because our two speakers have left. So, if you're okay to answer anything, please feel free, everybody else who's in the room now, to take yourselves off mute and join in and say anything. You can raise your hand, you can do it like that, or you can use your reactions. And
do it.
That's a good way. That's a good way to do it, Pauline. This section is given over just to people who've joined on today, to let them tell us either their thoughts or what they're doing or what they hope to do, or if they've got any questions for the Answer Cancer staff, what we're doing, or anything. So, does anybody have any questions? Go for it, Pauline.
Okay, hi, lovely to see you all, meet you all today. I'm got a wonderful title. I'm called the Baby Friendly Initiative Project Manager for Salford, and I work in partnership with UNICEF to increase breastfeeding rates. But let's put that to one side at the minute. I've joined with you today because I've had quite a lot of training about LGBTQ and communication within the health service. I particularly work with the Health Visiting Service in Salford. And across, I think we're called Northern Care Alliance now. We change our name every 5 seconds, so we could be anywhere really. One of the things that we're planning to do is we actually have new health visitors who have mandatory training around infant feeding. So it isn't around cancer as such, although, and some of the issues we face is the language that's being used and how parents, particularly same-sex parents, are being treated in maternity and in health visiting. How do you address what you say, and particularly around if they want to feed the babies, if you've got two mums who want to feed whatever, and we have chest feeding, etc., etc. So it isn't necessarily to do with Answer Cancer, but my plan is to engage in as many of these things as I can, so that I can understand how we can communicate, do training with health visitors around any communication, so they can share that. I mean, obviously, if they pick up on anything that needs to be done, they refer on to various organisations, etc. So because we've got that actual opportunity to grab all these health visitors, and to actually, I do 2 half-day updates with them. I can do anything in those updates. So and I've got I think it's about 90 staff in the health visiting team, and I also work with the early help staff who are in the children's centres. So that's why I came on today, to listen to all these stories. And I've also attended a number of other training sessions because I want to deliver the training and understand what's happening. So that's really, thank you so much. It's been great. So that's it. That's all I wanted to say, really. And that's my plan. The next plan is to do 2 annual updates with all these staff. So it's about probably around 150, 200 staff that we can get these messages out to. And I'm just preparing some training at the moment, but it'd be great to get some of the speakers along as well, to just engage and just get in there and say how they feel, not necessarily around cancer issues, but around how they feel around how the health service in general actually deals with them. So thank you. Come on.
I was just going to say that's really interesting to hear, Pauline, and kind of what's really nice about it is quite often we work with or alongside or come across kind of different audiences who you wouldn't traditionally think, oh, they're in our kind of target that for kind of cancer conversations or kind of screening conversations, but kind of for us just kind of raising awareness of so-called teachable moments, just like what you're describing. I think is really key. It's very unlikely, it's less likely that health visitors might be working with kind of older people, but certainly a lot more likely, they'll be working with younger parents, with women who might be either approaching their age of first smear or kind of, be in that screening invite age. It might be that kind of there are conversations there, teachable moments about HPV vaccinations, for themselves, or kind of a wee bit further down the line for kind of other children. So, the fact that this is on your radar and that kind of amongst those discussions and around LGBT kind of inclusive approaches, fitting cancer in is brilliant.
I think we also deal with all the school nurses. So we have, immunisation nurses, we have school nurses who go in. So you've got schools as well, where you can start to raise awareness about lots and lots of issues. And it's just a way in, really. It's an add-on to what we do. But because we've already got that way in, it's great to add on all these other things. We're just in the process of harmonising our policies across NCA, because they're very much gender specific. So we're actually looking at changing the language within those policies. So because of that, we'll be able to engage in that communication. So that's great.
Brilliant. It's brilliant to hear.
Well, Pauline, just want to add, I mean, you're working in Salford. Is this a Salford, did you say, Pauline? Is it just Salford?
Yes, it is Salford. I work in Salford, but Amanda Hadlow was on before. Right. She works in Rochdale and Oldham, and we work right across the Northern Care Alliance. I think that's Oldham, Rochdale, all those places. Bury. You say Bury, don't you? I'm from Liverpool, so I say Bury.
Say Bury.
I love it.
You say Bury. Great. They say Bury.
The only reason I'm saying is because I've met a link worker in Bolton who said the same thing about engaging with parents in schools, because he felt that the messages around cervical screening was reaching too late, and that generation of young children are actually educating their parents. So I think we've touched within our program about doing the work in schools and where the line is, because our program is so limited in some ways by capacity, and reaching out to all the different audiences in different ways across the different localities is quite a challenge. But finding ways in, I think, your route.
I can be a way in, I feel, so that if any of you've got my email, so I'm happy to share that. So if you wanted to weigh in, just let me know and I'll see what I can do. I can't promise.
Oh no, it's good to know that you can do. Yes, thanks.
I can try. Thank you.
Pauline, I'm sorry I came on slightly late. Where are you from?
I'm from Salford, Salford Royal NHS